Get it to work himself into those photos.
I get it.
I was like, come on, dude. That's not even a big stake. 12:30 on the dot. Thank you all for coming in. And I know we switched the time a little bit, but we did it yesterday, so we're still operating in the normal on-time fashion. Today we'll be bringing out another judiciary bill. That's why we have the esteemed chair of the Judiciary Committee, Representative Stafstrom, here to talk about one of the Attorney General's priority bills. And go right into it.
So we're still working. We're hoping to finalize a couple of the last-minute details and some late-minute requests from the Republicans on this. But working on House Bill 7222, which is the Attorney General's civil rights bill. It would codify into law certain powers of the Attorney General to investigate and bring civil rights lawsuits in response to large-scale systematic violations of existing constitutional or statutory rights on behalf of the state. So what this is looking at is certainly, as we've seen, an uptick in interest in bigotry and hate crimes legislation and proliferation of those, as well as sort of widespread violations of civil rights, not sort of the one-off case of someone who feels they were discriminated against at work, but sort of a pattern or practice of conduct by an actor to allow the Attorney General to investigate and ultimately bring lawsuits in the name of the state of Connecticut and with the resources and backing of his office.
Could you go through some of the other cases that Attorney Generals elsewhere with similar departments have done, just to give a flavor for the type of...
So there's actually 22 states that currently have some sort of civil statutory right enforcement provision allowed by their Attorney General. So some of the examples that have been cited is recently the California Attorney General entered into a settlement agreement with the University of Southern California to improve access to its campus transportation system for individuals with disabilities following an investigation into allegations that the transportation system at the university failed to comply with state and federal accessibility laws. The Washington State Attorney General recently signed an agreement with Facebook that legally binds Facebook to block advertisers from excluding race, religion, sexual orientation, and other protected classes when using its ad targeting tools. More locally, New York reached a settlement agreement with Con Ed recently over allegations of gender discrimination and sexual harassment against women in field positions. And under the terms of that agreement, Con Ed had to reserve $3.8 million to distribute among the settlement class. And then I think one of the kind of more interesting ones, again locally, is the New Jersey Attorney General recently reached a settlement with Advanced Auto Parts over allegations that the company failed to accommodate their employees' religious beliefs by scheduling an employee for fewer shifts during the week, when he advised the company that he refused to take shifts on Saturdays because it was the Sabbath.
So Connecticut currently cannot enforce laws protecting those with disabilities?
Well, this is sort of what's interesting. I mean, obviously you can bring there could be a criminal violation, there could be an action brought by sort of an outside interest group, but can the state of Connecticut itself bring a civil action? And the statutes are not entirely clear on that. So depending on who you ask, some people will say the Attorney General already has this authority, some will say he doesn't. What we're trying to do is codify it into statute and make it crystal clear the authority that the Attorney General does have in these types of actions.
What about the distinction between civil and criminal enforcement?
That remains unchanged under the bill and under the Constitution of the state of Connecticut. All criminal power is vested in the various states' attorneys through the different geographical areas around the state. This merely relates to civil enforcement ability, the ability to bring a civil action seeking either an injunction or some sort of declaratory relief, or monetary damages.
The version I read, it does not affect an individual's right to pursue their opportunities either through CHRO or getting a.
That's right. What this bill is attempted at is really sort of the pattern or practice in the most egregious violations. So the one individual who feels that they were adversely affected in terms and conditions of housing, or that they were discriminated against by their employer, they currently and will continue to have redress with the Commission on Human Rights and Opportunities, who would adjudicate that claim. This, by the terms of the bill, specifically says there has to be affected persons, meaning more than one. So presumably if it was an enforcement action against a company, for example, it would be where there are more than one individuals who were adversely affected by the same type of employment action. So there's a pattern or practice that women are being paid less than men. There's a pattern or practice that folks with a certain type of disability are not receiving reasonable accommodations. There's a pattern or practice that somebody's free speech rights, people's free speech rights within a particular organization are being violated. It's those types of issues.
Wouldn't these cases generally right now be brought by the U.S. Attorney's Office?
No, because the U.S. Attorney can only bring, again, criminal enforcement action. These are more civil actions where it might not rise to the level of a criminal offense, but that the somebody's seeking monetary damages or reinstatement.
But they do have an Office
do
of
have a
Civil
civil-
Rights that does enforce like ADA enforcement.
And they
If
file
there's a
civil
business that
actions.
doesn't,
I think on the ADA side they do, but they certainly
they have
will not.
filed civil actions though against.
But they won't enforce states' rights. And
Okay.
this would include both state law and state rights as well as federal law and federal rights. And also I think, certainly in that instance you're relying upon the federal government to police that activity as opposed to the state of Connecticut being able to do it itself.
Looking just through the joint paper report, the CBIA is concerned that this would expose businesses to excessive government investigations and civil penalties for undefined violations. The CCM, Connecticut Conference of Municipalities, also has concerns along the same. They would expose towns and cities to disproportionate government investigation and civil penalties. The Insurance Association Connecticut didn't support the bill as written. The National Federation of Independent Businesses didn't support the bill as written. What, if anything, has been done to address the concerns of these entities concerning overreach?
So the Attorney General has reached out to each of those. My understanding is the Attorney General's office has reached out to each of those organizations you've mentioned. I know, for example, CBIA has withdrawn their opposition to the bill. I'm not going to say they're in favor of the bill, but they're not lobbying against it at this point, is my understanding. And he has sort of emphasized that, again, these are really the most egregious actors. This is the Attorney General, even though it's the largest law firm in the state of Connecticut, certainly cannot police every single instance out there where somebody feels like their rights were violated, or even every group feels like their rights are violated, but that this would be targeted at some of the most significant cases and sort of the worst actors within the particular field.
And some people will say, well, what's the check, right? What is the check from what the chairman's saying is, well, what if an AG goes too far, right? And I think you might have that, if you ever got to a point where you had an attorney general bringing way too many, or for cases that we didn't think really deserve this or merit this kind of attention, the legislature can always change the statute back. And so a power overreach will be met with a power slap, is my gut.
And I think in addition to that, don't forget, what you're doing is you're vesting an authority in an elected official. And ultimately, the Attorney General is responsible back to the voters of the state of Connecticut every 4 years, and an Attorney General who is overly aggressive with this type of authority presumably could be slapped around by the voters.
Is there a fiscal note with this, or
There's
because
not.
depending on how aggressive he wants to be, if he wants to dedicate more resources to this, then when
He has not asked for an additional budget appropriation to do this. He'll do it with existing staff. The example I use is sort of any large law firm in the state of Connecticut. You can take on a certain number of cases based on the people that are available to take on those cases, and you have to prioritize work. And as I started with, he's not going to be able to take on every case that comes to his attention. He's going to have to necessarily screen those cases and decide which ones rise to the level of needing intervention.
How much does this have
Chris,
to
hang
do
on one
with?
second.
Go ahead, sorry, jump in.
Representative Blumenthal actually spoke in caucus yesterday and brought up a good point. Some of the members were, well, what's the ultimate need? Why do we need this? So I wanted to give him an opportunity to.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So I actually work in this area. I'm a private plaintiff's lawyer. I think it's important to note that this bill would not create any new substantive rights. It would just give the right to the Attorney General or the authority under certain circumstances to enforce those rights, which are already enforceable by private persons through private attorneys. And I think one of the important roles this authority would play and the Attorney General would play in these circumstances is that there are cases where there is a violation of someone's civil rights or civil liberties that we would consider very deleterious to our society or a business environment or an employment environment, but they may not give rise to the kind of monetary damages that would justify, from a business sense, a private plaintiff's lawyer being involved. And so we might, as a state, want those violations to have accountability. And the Attorney General would be able to fill that gap, either if it's a situation where a lot of people are experiencing a relatively small damages violation, or it's an egregious violation, but still there aren't the sort of physical damages or economic damages that would justify a private plaintiff's lawyer outlaying the costs and the time that would justify it from that private plaintiff's lawyer's point of view.
If the Attorney General is going to have a new purview, not necessarily a division, but new purview, he's going to have to hire more civil rights attorneys, right? So you got to be, I mean,
Like I said, he has not asked for that.
he hasn't asked for it yet, but he has asked for it now. But come on, you got to think.
He has said he will do this within the available staff in his office. He's going to have to prioritize
Do you
staff.
think in a year or
accordingly.
two he's going to ask for a couple civil rights attorneys to be hired?
We'll just say no.
He could, but he's going
something
to
else
try to get the appropriations committee to approve it.
The Attorney General is well versed in the difficult in the Appropriations Committee process, I
But is
think.
this how something starts? I mean, you start something, start a new program, start a new.
I think we'll see what the need is for it, and if it's something
Talented
that
lawyers.
Did Representative
there is
Blumenthal
a
want to
great-
comment on the potential danger of overly aggressive Attorney General?
I've never heard of such a thing.
I was
How much of this has to do with police misconduct? You haven't mentioned that at all.
that was not the crux that the bill was brought forward for. So,
So not much? None at all?
not,
It could be possible, but that was not the impetus for the bill.
Steve, does the opposition from industry make you think that maybe they have something to hide?
Look, I don't know. I mean, I think until you sort of allow the Attorney General the investigatory authority, but like I said, I think where he's looking to target is the most aggressive and most egregious offenses. As we said, for all the reasons, just as Max just said, there's only so many attorneys to go around. He's going to have to be very judicious in the types of cases in which he uses this authority for. I don't see this as sort of a massive revamping where he's going to be filing dozens upon dozens of cases a year. I think it would be a relatively finite number of cases that he will bring in a particular year on this.
okay.
Thank you,
Mr. Chair.
All right.
Before
Thanks,
you
Master.
go away, can I ask you all about marijuana for a
I
second?
knew that was
Well,
going to
we'd like
happen.
to hear
Yesterday,
about that.
general law changed the definition for an equity applicant for the marijuana legislation. So it broadens this definition to people who live in census tracts with high poverty and high unemployment. And that's different than the previous legislation that was really focused on neighborhoods that were affected by marijuana-related crimes. And so I'm curious what each of you think, if this is going to increase support for the bill in the House, or is this going to frustrate urban lawmakers who said the intent of this equity application status was to help people who had been affected by our marijuana laws previously?
It's a fine balance amongst all of them. Our caucus is very diverse. We represent major cities, we represent suburbs. As with everything else, we have to find the compromise within our own caucus to bring it out. We appreciate the work the General Law Committee put in, and we're gonna be caucusing it later this evening so we can lay out exactly how and why we landed where we did. And I can answer that question better after we have that caucus.
So what's been the tone on the issue so far in other discussions?
Really, it is sort of what I've continued to voice here. It's already here in the state of Connecticut. We decriminalized under an ounce, and when you go out of state to purchase, half ounce, when you go out of state to purchase, if you come in with less than that, the worst you'll face is a ticket. You go sit outside any of the dispensaries up in Massachusetts and you will see a large amount of Connecticut plates. So it's here, but we're not able to regulate the potency. We're not able to ensure that it's consistent with our beliefs as a state of what's available.
But there's no, from what I've been told, every time you change it, as she was suggesting, you lose people here and you
That's the
gain-
legislative process.
Right, but
It's
my
like a
question
budget.
is, so if you brought it up tomorrow, it wouldn't pass.
Who knows? I don't know. We didn't caucus it. We're caucusing it tonight and we'll have a better idea.
Keating reported yesterday that Looney wants to see us in a special session because it's.
I think Looney's taking the lead on what I said because, I said if it was an issue that wasn't completed, that I'd be willing to come back in for a special session on both marijuana and sports gambling. It looks as though we may have a bill that could be ready for action, and if that's the case, the majority leader's done a great job with the schedule. We have the entire next week to do all these major bills and get them up to the Senate in the time that would be appropriate for action. So I'm just not sure Marty knew where we're at.
So you think it's still possible you get it done, but you also you're trying to keep every option open
Every
right
option. That's typical for me.
Next
Yeah,
week,
now? Yeah,
exactly.
but you haven't caucused, but you must have a tone here, or you must have a sense.
Mike, the chairman of the General Law Committee, came in yesterday and felt very comfortable, the three committees that looked at it, that he has a bill that's balanced enough to where it could get the necessary votes in the House based upon early indications at the committee level and with consideration of the requirements the Senate wanted and the governor wanted to pass the Senate and get the signature. But we won't know that until it's a full-blown caucus in both the House and the Senate.
Do you think some of this outside influence, whether it's a social justice issue, whether, I mean, there are a lot of lobbyists here on the commercial end, all these changes, that kind of pollutes the process, doesn't it? And
No,
makes it more difficult to get the support that you may not even have to begin with.
No, I think that the changes that you are seeing are from the three public hearings that happened, right? We raise a concept, which is a general idea. Then we come up with a bill based upon the public hearing. We put it out there, we get feedback, we change it all the time. The AG bill, as one specific example, it's potentially being changed right now. The minimum wage, the basis of the bill was out there for everybody to see for almost 2 weeks. But there was subtle changes all the way up to the moment it ran. The majority leader stands up on the House floor quite frequently, not too much, and passes temporarily a bill, pulls it off, adds an amendment, makes it better. So it is part of the process. The part of the process is a compromise, and that's ultimately what we look to do.
And I go back to what I've said a few times on this, on any issue. If you ask people on an isolated question about something, you might get a different response than if you say, if you don't do this, these are other things that may have to happen. So part of being a legislator is not just focusing on issues narrowly, but also thinking about the broad picture. And so that can change debates too.
Stafstrom, what do you think about this change with the equity applicant? Does this undermine the intent of that?
No, I don't think it undermines the intent at all. I think, as it's been mentioned, what we're trying to do is get to a bill that has 76 votes in the House and 19 votes in the Senate, and the governor's going to sign. I mean, and obviously from the judiciary standpoint, we have cognizance with respect to the actual criminalization, the erasure issue, the driving issue, and as well as the workplace protections. So as the speaker was saying, the workplace protection issue and employers wanting some sort of protection, that language is still very much in flux. I think I'm supposed to meet tomorrow with CBIA on potential language they want, and we're continuing to work with stakeholders to hone and craft and perfect language that satisfies the concerns people have raised.
Yeah, but the census tract, though, I mean, that's just spreading it out. Okay, we won't just do it in the cities. Yes, we recognize there's some towns and there's some rural towns that have pockets of poverty. So, okay, everybody gets a piece of the action. Isn't that just classic log rolling, as you were alluding to earlier? You sweeten the pie, you make it a little larger.
Well, the current bill,
it's not city specific. It's based on census tracts,
and economics and demographics?
I think you may be right, if not for the other particulars in the bill that doesn't limit the amount of dispensaries, grow facilities, and production facilities. It's wide open. It's who can get in it, and it also is dependent on the local planning and zoning officials approving it. Towns can say, we don't want it. I think some would be encouraged to get in. I think there's a portion of it, 3.5%, going towards the local municipalities. So they're encouraged to get in. But if every single town in the state of Connecticut says no, then we're not up and running.
On the topic of tolls, real quick, to what extent is that bill still in flux? I think we heard originally $1.2 billion revenue goal, 800 million, and now down to what could be 700 million
But
today.
you're caucusing it
Is that
tonight,
still
are
in
you
flux?
We are. We can bring Representative Lamar in tomorrow. He can answer the questions more specifically. Again, it's a bill that requires 76 in the House, 19 in the Senate, or 18 plus the Lieutenant Governor and the Governor's signature. So yes, it has been moving a lot, but it's consistent with what we said all along. Coming up with 40% of the money coming in from out-of-state folks, providing the maximum amount of discounts for in-state Connecticut residents, guaranteeing the money only goes to the Special Transportation Fund to fix the projects to where the tolls were collected. It's still pretty consistent, but the nuance is the authority, the oversight authority, the Transportation Oversight Authority, to ensure that we're getting the best bang for our buck is an issue that we're going back and forth on. But it's getting there. But Representative Lamar, we'll get him here tomorrow. I mean, I really
think it's possible to do both marijuana and tolls next week?
Sure.
Would
Yesterday,
you do that
you-
promise for Lamar? Would you do tomorrow?
Tomorrow, yeah, we'll get Lamar. Lamar.
Yesterday, you voted in a bipartisan fashion to increase the penalties on fentanyl. What evidence do you have that increasing a penalty for drug-related crimes actually reduces the availability of the drug on the streets?
I don't think the reason we voted on that bill yesterday was necessarily to increase that one-off penalty. What it was is actually to bring fentanyl in line with our other controlled substances. So right now, there is a criteria for what constitutes a controlled substance, and there's a penalty associated with sale of a controlled substance. Fentanyl was never classified as a controlled substance by the legislature. It is by Department of Consumer Protection. But because the last time the controlled substance statute was looked at and written, fentanyl wasn't around. So merely what we were doing was a technical change to have the legislature classify fentanyl as a controlled substance.
And there's
so
about
saying
seven.
That this change, you don't intend for it to have any effect on the availability of this drug?
Well, I hope it has. I hope it has an effect on the availability of the drug, and people, it cuts down on the availability and the sale of it. I tend to agree with you. I'm not sure that necessarily increasing a penalty is in and of itself going to cut down on the sale or availability. But I think the rationale for the bill yesterday was to bring fentanyl in line with other controlled substance offenses.
And you have hundreds of mothers who have lost children who have been lobbying this issue very hard, and I believe they'll be at the state senate today to make their pitch. And that was not an easy conversation to have with those mothers either. I would add that.
And tolls is gonna be done as a separate bill, right? Standalone bill, might be pieces of it in the budget, but if you do tolls, will be a standalone bill or will be part of the budget?
Yeah, I think it's really complicated. That's my goal, Paul. I'll give a firm answer. I don't want to waffle it up. That is my intention. The problem with lumping it in with other issues, whether it be the budget or not, where you have votes on tolls, you may lose on the budget. Where you have budget votes but tolls are in there, it becomes more difficult. If we do enact it, we will have portions to which need to be covered in the budget.
And just to be clear, pot can be yanked back into the regular session, even though you initially thought it might be a special session. You can,
Yeah, so to be clear, any of the issues that we don't address in the regular session, it's never our goal to come back in the special session, but there's one of two ways that we can come back in the special session. The governor can call us back in, and once we're in, we can add additional areas, or we can do the call prior to adjourning CNADA on the last night to call ourselves in. It would require an agreement between the Senate President and myself, and it would need to be done before CNADA. So you would have a clear indication, unless the governor is going to call us back in, of whether we intend to do it in special session or not by the last night.
What about pregnancy centers?
Pregnancy centers, we had a caucus, we had a very good conversation. I think that's an issue that could be acted upon this week.
I will say that on that issue, there are some amendments online that have been filed that are concerning to NARAL, to a lot of our caucus. A woman's right to choose is well settled law in Connecticut, and it's disappointing to see amendments to the contrary.
The
Well, look at Al.
exemption, where is that standing? I understand there's still negotiations between both chambers.
I think we're very close to an announcement on that.
We had heard that the language-
Today, tomorrow, before the end of the week?
Very close in Hartford parlance is 48 hours or less.
The language in that amendment.
I don't know what in Weathersfield it means, but in Hartford it means less.
Lowell Lamar probably said a dozen times during the finance meeting,
Yeah.
well, that's under negotiation, well, that's under negotiation. Take your pick of
Yeah.
what it was, of what the issue on tolls was. Is that really transparent on something that big? I mean,
Yeah.
or you.
Look, I said it yesterday and you missed it. The facts themselves, the
Yeah.
final bill is going to be the final bill, and it'll be out there for people to see. But as far as trying to put facts out there, the moment you said 82 gantries, now you go to the GOP's place, and it's 82 gantries. They said it once, so that's the fact. We cut it down to 50 gantries, and they're like, oh, no, it's not going to be 50 gantries. In-state discounts, they don't believe it. So I've actually advised and begged Roland to be very vague with the details until the plan's finalized, because the problem is if you say it once and it changes, next thing you know, you're lying to the public and you're misleading and you're back to your same old tricks. So to avoid that trap, and it is a trap, we're being very vague. When the bill comes out, it will be our intention to it's not going to be an amendment that comes out 10 minutes before it runs. We're going to give adequate time for people to look at it, and it's going to be consistent with what we've said all along.
Do you think members tonight will have more detail than what's been released publicly?
Yeah, I think that will be the case. I mean, the way the caucuses work for House Democrats, and I'm sure it's everywhere else, is what's said in caucus stays in caucus, and those details will not come out, my hopes, because it does taint the debate. And if some things do change, it becomes harder to make those changes.
Just back to the vaccine religious exemption for one moment. The language in that amendment we had heard yesterday would not only include public schools, but also daycares and nursing homes. Is that still the case?
We're working through it.
But there was still, the majority leader upstairs said that we're still not certain which chamber it would come to first.
We're working through it. Like I said, we'll have an announcement, my guess is in the next 48 hours.
Hey, Joe, do you think that all these Republican road shows on the tolls is really like the 2020 campaign? It's just, a rolling statewide circus featuring Laura Devlin and Henry Martin?
I don't want to categorize what they were doing, but it was very clear there was political implications to what they were trying to do. The misportrayal of the facts spoke volumes to it, and good for Governor Lamont. He went down there and said, hey, wait a minute, it's not 82 gantries, and that's exactly what they said. Well, you said that once, so yeah, but the sad part about it is exactly what the majority leader alluded to yesterday. The only thing that's on the table from the GOP is prioritized progress, which puts billions and in some cases trillions of dollars of debt solely on the Connecticut taxpayer. And they're unwilling to come to the table to talk about it. I've invited them now several times publicly and privately. Let's have a conversation. Is there a middle ground? What can we get to? They don't want to engage, so they think it's a political issue. And that may be a smart gamble. It may not be a smart gamble. But I will tell you, if something was to happen in the state of Connecticut to where there was a tragedy that we've had before, I don't want to be the party that was going around saying, well, I knew it was the right thing to do and we had to do something, but I didn't have the political appetite to try that.
Even if it's misleading, do you think it's been effective? In other words, you don't like what they're saying.
How many residents do we have in the state of Connecticut? What's our
3.5 million?
I'll say they got 100,000 people on a petition. I don't think that's a clear majority.
But given what you just said about what's said in caucus, and your instructions to Representative Lamar to be vague, what good is it going to do for us to question him here tomorrow?
I think hopefully tomorrow we'll have a better idea where he's at. And to be honest with you, Mark, and that's a fair question. If we're still not there to where he can provide some rock solid, I'll probably say, look, we're still not there yet. And as soon as it's close, I will have him here.
And Chris, can I just go back to the election question, or Ken that asked that too, I think. Look at Will Haskell in Westport, Connecticut. Look at Jonathan Steinberg in Westport, Connecticut.
Senator
Look at
Bergstein.
Senator Bergstein down in Greenwich. They ran on the issue. In Fairfield County, it was unfathomable that you could run on that. I don't know what Representative Blumenthal ran on, but I will say that a lot of our members did that in Fairfield County, and 10 years ago, that was the death knell. Not only did they win, they won relatively easily. So they're not afraid to have that conversation. They're in the beast of the bell. They're in the belly of the beast, right? And they won. So there's something to be said about that.
And if you say their needs are different, okay, that's fair enough. But look at me. I put myself so far out there. Probably Tony Guerrero and I were in the same place, same type of district. I'm back. It may not have been a huge margin, but my district was very clear where I was at with tolls. We've had success.
Is it 13?
50, Mark. How dare you?
I'm sorry.
Landslide.
Landslide Joe. I saw Joe
Landslide
Courtney,
Joe, big.
and I asked to take his name, and he said it
Getting
was
my
okay.
landslides mixed up.
Yeah.
He
So-
campaigned for 2 weeks, or was it 3?
Mark, is that fair? It was never about who, it's about who he's running against. So,
How many
All right,
players
all
are on
right.
the football team? How many?
11.
see, now you know why he's a Hall of Famer.